It's a great pleasure to introduce Brother Kelvin Canavan. Kelvin, of course, is a towering figure in Catholic education and education more broadly. And it was a great pleasure when he so willingly agreed when I was speaking to him about speaking this afternoon. For those of you who don't know, he was the CEO, the Catholic Education Office Director here in Sydney, I think almost entirely during its period before it broke into 3 dioceses. Is that correct? For a long time. For well over 2 decades that he was the CEO Director and is now Emeritus, which is, I thought, a very clever sort of title to have inherited. He's lectured across the world and has been in demand as a speaker in the US, the UK, Philippines, Ireland, Germany, Mauritius and Hong Kong. Not a lot of hardship postings, but some very good places to speak, and has got a Bachelor of Arts degree from Sydney University, a Master's of Science from Cornell in New York, and the Doctorate of Education from the University of San Francisco. Is a prolific author and speaker, but more importantly, in terms of his contribution today, was one of those people who combined the thinking and activity of the intellectual exercise with actually creating a system for making school education work. And for all those reasons, we are really delighted to have you here.
Thank you. Well, thanks to Eric and the Institute for the invitation, ladies and gentlemen, and also thanks to Alan. I have no PowerPoint, but there are copies of my text available at the end of this. I just want to say, as a young inspector of schools, I first met Gough Whitlam at a public meeting in April 1969. The meeting was organised by the Federation of Catholic Parents and Friends Association. We gathered in the cinema in Rose Street, Eastwood. It was a Sunday evening and 1,500 people were packed in, and there was standing room only. The state and federal political leaders were invited to speak, and they spoke about their respective parties' attitude to financial assistance for Catholic and other non-government schools. The parents were well organised and quizzed the speakers on the actual dollars and cents they could expect to receive and by when. Now, this was one of a series of 8 meetings organised by the parents in this time, and Gough Whitlam attended 7 of the 8 meetings. And the final meeting was at the Sydney Town Hall on the 6th of June 1969. 5,000 people crowded into the main hall, the lower hall, and onto the steps. And these were the years before OH&S requirements. And proceedings were broadcast live on radio station 2SM. Again, all the political parties were represented. This was a high-stakes meeting with half the evening devoted to questions and answers. And the major parties were forced to be very specific about their future school funding policies at both state and federal levels. And the MPs had nowhere to hide. Now, Gough Whitlam was in full flight. Archbishop James Carroll and Malcolm Fraser had just spoken. Whitlam reminded the audience that the 1966 ALP Federal Conference and now the Labor Caucus supported the establishment of a Commonwealth inquiry into the needs and priorities of government and non-government schools and how these priorities would be funded. What I'd like to do is, this was a 12-minute speech. We'll pick it up at the 5-minute mark and listen to it for 4 or 5 minutes. This will be available through the Institute on their website eventually. Thank you very much.
If you look, not what I'll be saying in the next budget, but what I said in the last budget, on my speech on the 20th of August last, you'll find that I made the same basic speech as I will make tonight and as I've made at Manly and Miranda and Lane Cove and Eastwood and in the rural community, as the Herald describes it, of St Mary's. And the general context in which I speak is in the context outlined by His Grace Archbishop Carroll. We are all concerned for the future of Australian youth. Government and non-government schools in Australia are not as good as schools in comparable countries, particularly in the training and ratio of their staffs. There's no prospect of Australian schools catching up to schools in comparable countries unless and until the Commonwealth becomes continuously and comprehensively involved in financing them. And the speech that I make on an occasion like this is basically the same as that I make to the Parents and Citizens Associations or that I give in answers to numerous correspondence. It is divisive and destructive of our educational opportunities as individuals and as a nation if the state and Catholic school systems appear to be in conflict. The pupils of both systems will be the first sufferers in the event of such a conflict. It enriches and consolidates the educational opportunities of us all if the two systems understand each other and work together. The necessary Commonwealth assistance is deferred by arguments over state rights and state aid. That is, by arguments about Commonwealth and state responsibilities and government and Catholic systems. The teachers and parents of students at government schools, I believe, should realise they will not receive the necessary Commonwealth assistance unless similar assistance is also given to non-government schools. And my conviction is that the Catholic schools will not receive as much of the Commonwealth aid as they need unless the state schools also receive Commonwealth aid. The Commonwealth has never made a comprehensive and continuous commitment for schools as it has for universities. The Labor Party's attitude to Commonwealth aid for schools is the same as the attitude which all parties now adopt towards Commonwealth aid for universities. Once the Murray Committee's report had been made in 1957 and implemented the following year in respect to universities, in every subsequent year, in each house of the Federal Parliament, my colleagues and I have moved for a similar inquiry into the needs of schools, government and non-government. I promised such the first time I led a national campaign for my party at the Senate elections at the end of '67. We got a majority in this state of the senators, 3 out of 5. We moved such a resolution in each house in March last year. We were frustrated in both houses. Inevitably, the proportion of our population at school, particularly in secondary schools, will rise, with an accompanying rise in the expenditure on buildings, equipment and staff. The revenues of the states and the sacrifices of the Church cannot meet this expenditure. No improvement has been achieved anywhere since the war in fields requiring public expenditure except on the initiative or with the participation of the Commonwealth. Assertions that any particular matter is a state, not a Commonwealth responsibility, are no more than efforts to prevent or restrict increased public expenditure on that matter.
I found this tape in the archives only maybe 5 or 6 years ago. I had it put on a CD and I sent one to Gough Whitlam, and he phoned up the next day and he said, well, thanks for that. He said, I've just listened to it with my staff up here in William Street. And I said, was it one of your finer speeches? He said, well, it was pretty good. And he reminded me then how those opportunities to be in a hall with a big crowd there have gone with television and other things. And so we talked about it, and on another occasion he referred to it. Well, as you know, the Whitlam government, well, the Labor Party was elected in December '72, and Whitlam became Prime Minister. And he quickly put together the membership of the promised inquiry. Under the leadership of Peter Carmel, this committee surveyed the needs of Australia's 9,500 schools, and the committee reported back within 5 months. The Carmel report addressed many of the shortcomings and inequalities Whitlam had spoken about, and it proposed a series of funded programs that were to be needs-based. The recommendations were implemented without delay, and the Commonwealth, through its Schools Commission, quickly became a major player in school education. Expenditure on schools was rapidly increased to fund the new programs. In 1973-4, the Commonwealth expenditure was $240 million. It doubled the next year, and in 75-6 it had risen to $36 million. By comparison, in 1999-2000, the Commonwealth expenditure on schools was $4.8 billion. And in 2009-10, the Commonwealth expenditure on schools was $20 billion. And of course, before the election of the Whitlam government, Catholic schools were in a parlour state, and the future was far from certain. Just let me give an example. In the 60s, I taught in Catholic primary schools in Sydney. Classes were large, partly explained by the post-war immigration, and facilities were inadequate. And there was zero government funding for these schools. The only support the schools got in that period was the free milk, and that was a part of the deal. To be more specific, in 1966, I taught 68 boys in a year 5 at Morris Brothers Eastwood, and I was also responsible for the primary department. The school was similar to other Catholic schools. The demand for places outstripped the supply, and the very survival of these schools was uncertain. In the late 60s, the financial situation became so desperate that the Sydney Catholic Archdiocese considered a proposal to have either primary or secondary schools, but not both. That was a proposal that was looked at. However, in 1968, small government recurrent grants, $12 a primary student, $18 a secondary student, gave some hope, and the schools remained open. Let me read from the Carmel report, May 73. Level of resources, both human and physical, are inadequate. Inequality in school funding needs to be addressed. Need for a system of basic, recurrent and building grants for all schools according to need. Carmel talked about the need to raise the standard of underperforming schools. Educational outcomes need to be improved, and there's need for specific purpose programs to meet the needs of particular students. And he said parents have a right to educate their children outside government schools, and diversity is important. Now, Catholic school teachers, the parents and the students soon saw the benefit of this additional Commonwealth funding. More teachers were employed, and the average class sizes started coming down. And resources were available to help students from non-English speaking backgrounds, and the new Disadvantaged Schools program provided additional opportunities for students in low SES schools. Much of the opposition to the funding of Catholic schools by governments and the sectarianism that was very obvious in the 50s and early 60s had largely disappeared by the early 1970s. Gough Whitlam, I believe, played a key role in this change of attitude across the electorate. He gave legitimacy to the claim by Catholic parents for some funding for their schools. It was a justice issue rather than a religious issue for Whitlam. He also raised community expectations about the future role of the Commonwealth in school education. Now, Whitlam was well pleased with his early successes, and in his election policy speech in April 1974, he said, quote, "Parents of Australia well know, and history will record, that the greatest single achievement of our government in its first year was to change the face of education in Australia and to change the basic attitudes of the Australian people towards education." End quote. So over the next 40 years, the role of the Commonwealth has continued to expand. Recurrent funding was indexed annually to keep pace with rising costs, and the funds for capital works were available on a needs basis. A consequence of the decision by the Whitlam government to fund Catholic systemic schools through Catholic education officers and commissions, which would distribute the block funds according to need, led to the growth and development of Catholic education officers, which I might say are unique to Australia. In addition to recurrent capital funding programs, we now have a national curriculum, a national testing assessment program, the Smarter Schools National Partnership Program, the review of funding, and a national My Schools website. And as a response to the global financial crisis, all primary schools now have a new hall or some other facility built by the Commonwealth. Federalism saves Catholic schools. Federalism saved Catholic schools, and for the past 25 years, these schools have contributed to the nation by educating some 20% of all students in Australia. The Commonwealth now contributes 57% of the net recurrent income for Catholic schools, the states and territories 20%, and parents and private resources at 23%. And prior to 68, prior to the Whitlam speech, Catholic schools received no recurrent funds. These schools now, these Catholic systemic schools, now have a net recurrent income about 10% below government schools. This funding has enabled Catholic schools to survive and to contribute to the common good. However, the recent wide-ranging review of funding for schooling, led by conducted by that eminent panel led by David Gonski, reminds us that when measured against some very specific, and I might say limited international benchmarks, quote, Gonski says, "Over the last decade, the performance of Australian students has declined at all levels of achievement, notably at the top end." But Whitlam would be pleased with the continuing and comprehensive involvement of the Commonwealth in school education, but then disappointed to read in Gonski, quote, "Australia needs effective arrangements for funding schools across all levels of government, arrangements that ensure resources are being provided where they are needed. The current funding arrangements for schooling," says Gonski, "are unnecessarily complex. They lack coherence and transparency and involve a duplication of funding efforts in some areas." Gonski went on to state, "There is an imbalance between the funding responsibilities of the Australian government and state and territory governments across the schooling sector, and," he said, "a significant increase in funding is required across all schooling sectors, with the largest part of this increase flowing to the government sector due to the significant number and greater concentration of disadvantaged students attending government schools." End of quote. The Gonski review echoes much of what we read in Carmel in 73. Let me just explain. Gonski said, "A new schooling resource standard is required as a basis for the funding of schools according to need." Carmel proposed a school resource index with the 8 categories, A to H. Gonski speaks about the reducing educational disadvantage as a high priority, improved educational outcomes of disadvantaged students. Carmel proposed the Disadvantaged Schools program. Gonski talks about educational outcomes need to be improved. That's what Carmel said. Gonski talks about the choice of schooling as a value supported by many parents, and Carmel spoke about the rights of parents to choose. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, 3.5 million students are at the centre of this quality report, and for the sake of present and future students, it's imperative that the Australian state and territory governments, the major political parties and the various stakeholder groups work together on the Gonski blueprint to develop a new funding mechanism that is fair and equitable, designed to improve outcomes for students and reduce educational disadvantage. The Gonski report calls all involved in education to take a long-term view for the sake of a generation of young people and the future of Australia. Friends, it would be a sad day if the opportunity to develop a new funding system is lost. Thank you.